The training hall smelled faintly of gun oil and dust, the kind of place where men in uniform moved with brisk efficiency and confidence. Rows of recruits were scattered across long wooden tables, each one assigned some task: cleaning pistols, polishing magazines, assembling rifles under the watchful eyes of instructors. Among them, a woman sat quietly, her posture straight but unassuming, her hands folded neatly on the table as though waiting for someone to tell her what to do. She didn't wear the same swagger on her shoulders as the others, and she certainly didn't have the kind of reputation that preceded some of the hardened veterans in the room. To many she was just a visitor, an outsider who had somehow earned the right to sit in their midst. That was why when the senior officer pointed her toward a pile of disassembled weapon parts and said, almost dismissively, "You can help by cleaning these," most of the recruits chuckled under their breath. It wasn't mockery in the loud, crude sense, it was the quiet, knowing sort of laughter that said they didn't expect anything remarkable from her. The parts in front of her were not just any weapon, they belonged to one of the unit's prized sniper rifles, broken down into its components, scattered like a puzzle across the table. The task seemed simple enough: wipe them down, ensure no dust or grime remained, and leave the rest to the men who knew how to handle real firepower. She nodded once, wordless, and picked up the cleaning cloth, beginning with the barrel. Around her, the chatter grew, boasts of marksmanship, stories from deployment, friendly rivalries exchanged with half-serious tones. No one paid her much attention. She was meant to be invisible, the kind of presence that blended into the background of a room dominated by louder personalities. But as her fingers moved, something shifted. She wasn't just cleaning, she was handling each piece with an intimacy that didn't belong to a novice. Her hands traced the curves of the steel with assurance, not hesitation. She knew the weight of each part, the exact function it served, and the precise order in which it would fit into the greater whole. She wasn't looking for instruction, she already knew it. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the cleaned parts in a row, not randomly but in an arrangement that mirrored the sequence of reassembly. One of the recruits noticed, raising an eyebrow, but said nothing. Another leaned back in his chair to watch, curiosity piqued. It was subtle at first, like watching someone hum a tune you didn't expect them to know by heart. Then she closed her eyes. At first, the men thought she was pausing, maybe taking a break, but instead, her hands moved with even greater confidence. Blindfolded by nothing but her own eyelids, she began fitting the parts together. The snap of the locking pin, the slide of the bolt, the soft click of precision metal meeting precision metal, it was a rhythm, a language she seemed to speak fluently without needing sight. The room grew quieter. Conversations faltered. Even the instructors who had been pacing along the rows, stopped in their tracks to watch. Her hands never hesitated. Each movement was smooth, practiced, efficient, as though she had done this 100 times before under far harsher conditions. A murmur spread among the recruits. "Is she?" one whispered. "No way," another muttered, leaning closer. The disbelief was palpable, but so was the growing respect. It was one thing to assemble a rifle with eyes open, but to do it blindfolded required not just technical skill but instinct born of long, intimate familiarity. She tightened the last screw, pulled the bolt back, and with a sharp metallic sound, the sniper rifle was whole again. She placed it on the table in front of her, still without opening her eyes, her fingers resting lightly on the weapon as though it were an old friend. Only then did she look up, her expression calm, almost indifferent, as if what she had just done was nothing special at all. Silence followed, the kind of silence that carried weight. The men who had chuckled earlier found themselves avoiding her gaze, their smirks gone. The instructors exchanged glances, some surprised, others impressed, but all acknowledging what they had just witnessed. This wasn't luck, nor was it a trick. It was skill, raw, undeniable skill. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then finally one of the officers cleared his throat and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" She shrugged lightly, offering no explanation. The simplicity of her answer, or rather the absence of one, made the act even more enigmatic. She wasn't bragging, she wasn't seeking approval, and she certainly wasn't trying to prove herself. She had simply done what she knew how to do, and that quiet confidence was more intimidating than any boast. The recruits stared at the rifle, then at her, then back again. In that instant, something had changed. She was no longer the outsider given a trivial task. She had claimed the room's attention, not by demanding it but by earning it in a way that could not be dismissed. And deep down, every man there knew that the simple woman they had underestimated had just revealed a truth they hadn't seen coming. She was more dangerous, more capable, and perhaps more disciplined than most of them could ever hope to be. The room had shifted since her quiet display, the air heavier, the men more alert. What had begun as a casual training exercise was now something else entirely, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had underestimated the woman before them. Yet not everyone was impressed in silence. From the back of the hall, a tall figure stepped forward with the kind of swagger that drew attention before he even spoke. His uniform bore the insignia of a Navy SEAL officer, and his reputation preceded him. Stories of his precision, his toughness, his unshakable pride were whispered in the barracks and shouted in the field. To him, skill was not just respected, it was owned, and the idea of being upstaged by someone outside his circle, especially a woman without rank or record to her name, was a challenge to his pride. He crossed the floor with deliberate steps, his boots echoing in the sudden quiet. "Impressive," he said, his tone thick with something between sarcasm and genuine acknowledgement. "But cleaning and clicking parts together isn't the same as firing. Anyone can memorize the mechanics if they practice enough." His eyes narrowed slightly as if daring her to argue. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension rising. Some leaned forward eagerly, others exchanged wary glances, but none spoke. This was no longer about routine drills. This was about pride, about proving who truly belonged at the top of the hierarchy. The officer gestured toward the firing range that extended beyond the training hall. The target stood far away, barely visible as pale dots against the shadow of the distant hills. "Out there," he said, pointing toward the furthest one, so far it looked like nothing more than a speck of white. "No one can hit that. Not from here. Not with this rifle." His words were confident, almost taunting, as though daring her to step into his arena. His declaration drew a few nods from the men. They had all seen him shoot, they had all seen the distances he could cover, and if he said it was impossible, they believed him. The rifle on the table gleamed under the dim light, freshly assembled, its presence demanding a resolution. All eyes turned to her. She did not flinch under his stare. Instead, she studied the distant target for a long moment, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stood and reached for the rifle. The motion was calm, deliberate, as though she were accepting a task no different from cleaning the weapon moments earlier. Her silence only fueled the murmurs spreading through the recruits, their voices low but laced with anticipation. Some doubted, some hoped, but all were captivated by the tension building in the air. She walked toward the firing line with quiet confidence, the rifle cradled against her as if it were an extension of herself. The officer smirked, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't have to embarrass yourself," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "No shame in admitting you're out of your depth." His tone was sharp, a deliberate push meant to rattle her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she adjusted the rifle, tested the weight against her shoulder, and settled into position. The world seemed to narrow around her. The chatter dimmed, the shuffling of boots and the rustle of uniforms faded into the background, and all that remained was the long stretch of distance between her and the target. She inhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, then exhaled, grounding herself in the stillness. The officer's smirk wavered ever so slightly as he noticed the precision of her movements. She wasn't fumbling or guessing. She was deliberate, practiced, as though this moment had come 1,000 times before in shadows no one else had seen. Her finger brushed the trigger, her cheek pressed gently against the stock, and her eyes narrowed down the scope. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the sharp crack of the rifle, a sound that split the air and carried across the range. Every head turned toward the distant target. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then a voice shouted, incredulous, "She hit it!" The words spread like fire, disbelief giving way to shock and shock giving way to awe. The officer's smirk vanished, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the target himself. Sure enough, the mark was there, clean and precise, proof that what he had declared impossible had just been done in front of everyone. The recruits erupted in murmurs, their voices rising with excitement, some laughing in disbelief, others shaking their heads as though they had just witnessed a trick of the mind. But she wasn't finished. Without looking at him, she adjusted the rifle again, her movements smooth, controlled, effortless. A second shot rang out, then a third, each one striking with uncanny accuracy. By the time she lowered the rifle, the murmurs had transformed into stunned silence once more. She stepped back from the line, her expression calm, her breathing steady as though she had done nothing remarkable. To her, it seemed this was not a performance, not an attempt to prove herself, but simply a task completed as it needed to be. The officer's jaw tightened, his pride wounded in a way no physical blow could have managed. Around him, the men avoided his eyes, their respect subtly shifting away from his dominance toward the quiet strength of the woman who had just proven him wrong. He opened his mouth as if to say something, to reclaim control of the moment, but no words came. She had not only hit the target, she had shattered the unspoken hierarchy of the room. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The rifle still rested in her hands, cool metal against steady skin, but the weight of the moment was heavier than steel. Dozens of eyes clung to her figure, some wide with admiration, others narrowed with disbelief, and one pair filled with something darker, humiliation. The SEAL officer's jaw flexed, his pride cracking beneath the reality that a so-called outsider had just done what he had loudly declared impossible. For a man like him, whose identity was carved from precision, strength, and control, being proven wrong was not just a bruise to the ego, it was a wound that throbbed in front of an audience. His authority, the aura of invincibility he wore like armor, had been pierced by a single act that required no bravado, only skill. The recruits shifted uneasily, caught between their loyalty to his rank and their awe for her calm defiance of expectation. She laid the rifle on the table without ceremony, almost as if to dismiss the significance of what had just occurred. To her, it was simply a shot taken, a skill exercised, a truth demonstrated. She did not smile, did not gloat, did not seek applause. And that silence on her part, the absence of arrogance, was what stung the officer even more. Pride could recover from a fight, from shouted challenges and loud declarations, but quiet disregard left wounds that lingered. He stepped forward, his boots heavy against the concrete, his posture radiating the need to reclaim control of the room. "Lucky shots," he said flatly, his tone clipped, sharp as a blade. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." The words hung in the air, hollow to everyone who had seen her pull the trigger with precision and control. A few recruits exchanged glances, their respect for him waning in ways he didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he did, and that was why his words carried more bite than confidence. She didn't look at him. She simply cleaned her hands with a cloth, wiping away invisible oil, her gaze distant as though her thoughts were already elsewhere. This only deepened the sting. The officer cleared his throat, then gestured toward the armory where more weapons rested. "A rifle is one thing," he said louder this time for everyone to hear. "But combat isn't about single shots at a stationary target. It's about speed, adaptability, and hitting moving marks under pressure. Anyone can line up a lucky hit if they take their time, but real soldiers don't have that luxury." His eyes drilled into her, daring her to refuse. The recruits straightened, sensing what was coming. A challenge, a test designed not just to measure her skill but to break her composure. The range staff moved quickly, wheeling out mechanical targets, the kind that shifted and darted unpredictably, mimicking movement across a battlefield. Motors whirred as the silhouettes came to life, sliding back and forth, rising and dropping with erratic rhythm. It was a test designed to push even experienced shooters to their limit, a drill where seconds mattered and hesitation spelled failure. The officer smirked, confident that this would expose her as nothing more than a fluke, her earlier display a trick of circumstance. "Hit 5 in a row," he said, his voice carrying authority again. "Do that and maybe you'll earn the right to stand here. Otherwise, step back and leave this to professionals." All eyes turned to her once more, anticipation sharpening the air. Some hoped she would walk away, sparing herself the humiliation of failure. Others leaned forward, eager to see if she could match the impossible calm she had displayed before. She picked up the rifle without hesitation, adjusted her stance and walked toward the line. The recruits fell silent again, every breath caught in the same rhythm as her footsteps. At the firing position she didn't ask for instructions, didn't wait for encouragement. She simply lowered into position, the rifle steady, her movements precise. The officer crossed his arms, his smirk widening as the first target zipped into motion. The crack of the rifle split the air before anyone had even finished registering the target's path. The first silhouette jerked back, struck dead center. Gasps echoed across the range. Without a pause, she shifted, tracked the next, and fired again. Another clean hit. By the third, the recruits were on their feet, their disbelief transforming into raw energy. The officer's smirk faltered as the fourth silhouette fell, the fifth followed, each shot seamless, each strike undeniable. By the time the echo of the last shot faded, the air was electric with silence and awe. 5 targets, 5 perfect hits, each executed with calm precision that seemed to mock the very challenge meant to undo her. She lowered the rifle, exhaled once and stepped back. There was no celebration, no grin of triumph. Just the same steady composure that had unsettled them all from the beginning. The recruits erupted, their voices clashing in a storm of disbelief and admiration. Some clapped, others cheered, their energy uncontrollable in the face of what they had just witnessed. The officer, however, stood motionless, his face stone, his pride shattered further with every cheer that wasn't for him. His words from earlier, "No one can hit that," still lingered in the air, exposed now as arrogance rather than truth. She set the rifle down gently, turned, and without looking at him, walked back toward the table. She didn't need to say anything. The silence she left in her wake was louder than any declaration she could have made. The range was still buzzing with energy, recruits talking over one another, voices breaking into laughter, disbelief, and praise. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The officer's words had been treated as law, his challenges as immovable walls, but she had dismantled them both without raising her voice, without breaking a sweat. That was what unsettled him most. It wasn't just that she had succeeded, it was that she had done so with such unnerving calm, as though the impossible wasn't impossible at all. For a man who had built his reputation on dominance and spectacle, being overshadowed by someone who seemed utterly uninterested in recognition was unbearable. His eyes burned on her back as she sat quietly again, her hands folded as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. He couldn't allow this to end here. Not while every recruit in the room was still buzzing about her instead of him. "Enough," he barked suddenly, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. The recruits fell silent at once, their attention snapping back to him. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, but his jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. "You think hitting a few targets makes you a soldier? You think that proves anything?" He stepped forward, gesturing toward her with a hand that trembled just slightly. "Combat isn't about standing still with a rifle. It's about pressure. It's about endurance. It's about performing when your lungs are burning, your muscles screaming, and your mind on the edge of collapse. You want to impress this unit? Prove yourself under that kind of fire." His words carried the weight of a challenge designed to crush. It was no longer about accuracy alone. He was going to test her stamina, her strength, her ability to function when every fiber of her body wanted to give up. This was his arena, at least it always had been. The staff moved quickly, understanding his intent. Within minutes, the training field had been transformed into an endurance course. Weighted packs were lined up, heavy enough to buckle knees after just a few steps. Obstacles were reset. Low crawls beneath barbed wire, walls to be scaled, ditches to be crossed, and at the end of it all, a rifle waiting for the shooter to prove they could still hit the target after being pushed to the breaking point. The recruits whispered among themselves, a mix of awe and apprehension. They knew how brutal the course was. They had run it before, stripped of pride by its merciless design. Most of them had stumbled, crawled, or collapsed long before the final shot was even possible. To expect her to endure it and then hit her mark afterward was almost cruel. But none dared to speak against the officer's decision. She rose from her seat without hesitation. No complaint, no question, no flicker of fear. She stepped toward the starting line as if this, too, was simply another task to be completed. Her calmness rippled through the recruits, leaving them unsettled. The officer watched her with a tight smile, confident that this time she would falter. No one could glide through an endurance course as easily as assembling a rifle or pulling a trigger. This would expose her limits, remind everyone that she was, after all, just human. The whistle blew and she moved. The pack hit her shoulders with brutal weight, but she adjusted quickly, her steps steady. She crawled beneath the barbed wire, mud streaking across her arms, her elbows digging deep with efficient rhythm. No wasted motion, no frantic scrambling. She scaled the wall next, the strain evident in her arms but her face unchanged, her breathing steady. One by one she conquered each obstacle, her body working like a machine honed for this purpose. Sweat clung to her forehead, dirt streaked her skin, but there was no hesitation in her movements. Every time the recruits expected her to stumble, she didn't. Every time they thought the weight would drop her to her knees, she kept going. By the halfway point, whispers spread again, disbelief threading through the watching crowd. "She's not even slowing down," one muttered. "No one runs it like that," another said, shaking his head. The officer clenched his fists, his smirk beginning to falter as he watched her dismantle the course that had humbled countless recruits. His test was supposed to break her, but instead, it was breaking the illusion of his superiority. Each wall she scaled, each crawl she completed, stripped him of the authority he had tried to reclaim. And then, at last, she reached the end. The rifle lay waiting on a platform, gleaming beneath the harsh sun. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, sweat dripping down her temple, but her hands were steady as she picked it up. The officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Now let's see you shoot," he muttered under his breath. The target downrange flickered into focus, a silhouette standing still, daring her to try. She inhaled, exhaled, raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The crack echoed, the shot landing center mass. Cheers erupted immediately, the recruits unable to contain themselves. She wasn't finished. She adjusted, fired again, another perfect strike. By the third, they were roaring, the sound a wall of energy that shook the field. She lowered the rifle, her breathing calm once more, her expression unchanged. To her, it was just another task completed. The officer's face was pale now, his authority bleeding out in front of everyone. He had set the rules, raised the stakes, tried to design her downfall, and she had walked through it as though it were nothing. He wanted to shout, to find another excuse, another test, another way to claw back control, but every eye in the field was no longer looking at him. They were looking at her, with awe, with respect, with the kind of admiration no rank could demand. She had not asked for their loyalty, but she had earned it, and in the military that distinction was everything. The field was still alive with energy, recruits buzzing in disbelief at what they had witnessed. They had run that course countless times, and most had collapsed somewhere along the way, their lungs seared, their bodies drained. Yet she had not only finished it, she had finished it with poise, precision, and accuracy sharp enough to shame even the most seasoned shooters. For the men watching, she had become something more than an anomaly. She was proof that control, discipline, and calm under pressure could eclipse brute force. But for the SEAL officer it was unbearable. Each cheer, each nod of respect cast toward her, was another blade twisting into his pride. His face was hard, his jaw tight, but beneath the surface, his ego was bleeding, his reputation unraveling before the very eyes of those he had always commanded with unshakable confidence. He stepped forward, forcing his presence back into the center of the gathering. His boots struck the dirt with sharp authority, silencing some of the whispers, though not the admiration that still hung in the air for her. "Enough of this," he said, his voice cutting through the crowd. "Shooting targets and running courses doesn't make you a soldier. Out there you don't just fire from a distance or crawl through mud, you fight. Face to face. Hand to hand. When the rifle is gone, when the bullets are spent, when it's you or the enemy, that's when we find out who really survives." His words were heavy, laced with challenge and desperation. He was no longer interested in proving she was unskilled, he wanted to prove she was weaker, to strip her calm away with brute force. The recruits shifted uncomfortably. They knew what was coming. Hand-to-hand combat drills were brutal, often leaving participants bruised, battered, sometimes worse. To pit her against him wasn't just unfair, it was dangerous. He was taller, heavier, trained in combat techniques designed to incapacitate with efficiency. Some glanced at her, expecting hesitation, maybe even refusal. But she stood with the same steady presence she had carried through every test, her expression unchanging, her eyes calm. Without a word she stepped forward. The circle of recruits widened instinctively, forming a ring around them. The air grew heavier, the murmurs died, and the silence sharpened into anticipation. The officer shed his jacket, rolling his shoulders, his confidence returning with the crack of his knuckles. "You've impressed them with tricks," he said, his voice low, directed at her alone. "But this is real. This is where skill gives way to strength. And I promise you, no one walks away from me here without remembering it." He lunged first, a sudden strike aimed at her shoulder meant to overwhelm her immediately. But she wasn't there. She shifted lightly, letting his momentum carry him forward, her body moving with fluid precision. The recruits gasped at the speed of it, the way she had read his movement before it landed. He turned, snarling, coming at her again with a heavier swing. She ducked, redirected his arm, and with a subtle twist, forced him a step off balance. It wasn't about brute force, she wasn't trying to match his strength head-on. She was reading him, turning his aggression against him, flowing like water around his strikes. Each time he lunged, she redirected. Each time he swung, she slipped away, guiding his momentum into empty space. To the recruits it was mesmerizing. They had seen combat drills before, but rarely with such precision, rarely with such calm. She wasn't fighting to dominate, she was fighting to endure, to outlast, to demonstrate control. But the officer's frustration mounted with every failed strike, every gasp of admiration from the circle around them. His pride screamed louder than his reason. His strikes grew wilder, heavier, desperate to land something, anything to reassert his dominance. Finally, he rushed her in a full-bodied charge, hoping sheer mass would overwhelm her. But she stepped aside, her arm hooking against his, her foot planting firmly, and with a fluid motion that seemed almost effortless, she flipped his momentum forward. His body hit the dirt hard, the sound cracking through the silence like a rifle shot. The recruits roared in disbelief, some laughing, others shouting, unable to contain themselves. The officer lay there for a moment, stunned, his pride shattered more painfully than his body. She stepped back, not advancing, not gloating, simply waiting. Her breathing was steady, her stance relaxed, as though she had expected this outcome from the moment he had challenged her. The officer scrambled to his feet, fury blazing in his eyes. His face was red, his pride shredded, but he wasn't finished. He charged again, a fist aimed directly at her face. This time she caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and brought him down to one knee with a hold so precise he couldn't break free. Pain shot through his arm, his teeth gritted, but she didn't push further. She released him, stepping back once more, giving him space to rise. The recruits erupted again, their cheers louder, their respect unmistakable. This wasn't just luck, wasn't just tricks. This was mastery. She had shown that even stripped of weapons, stripped of distance, she was unshakable. The officer stood slowly, breathing hard, his pride in tatters. He could fight again, but everyone knew the outcome now. Every man in the circle had seen it. Every man understood what had just been proven. His authority was no longer his to claim. She hadn't needed to break him with words or boast of her skill. She had let her actions speak, and they spoke louder than anything he could say. The recruits looked at her with awe, their loyalty shifted, their respect undeniable. And for the first time since stepping into the room, the officer seemed small, his shadow eclipsed by someone who had never asked for it, yet commanded it all the same. The recruits were still buzzing with energy long after the officer staggered back into the crowd, his pride bruised more deeply than any part of his body. Their voices overlapped, filled with disbelief and exhilaration, some still replaying in their minds the precision with which she had dismantled him without ever striking in anger. They weren't just impressed, they were shaken as if they had witnessed something that defied the natural order of the room. For so long, the officer had been the immovable figure, the measure against which they gauged themselves. But now their loyalty had shifted, their eyes fixed not on him, but on her, the woman who had accepted every challenge without hesitation and prevailed with a calmness that unsettled them all. What had started as a cleaning task had spiraled into something no one could have predicted, and whispers of it would no doubt ripple far beyond this training hall. From the edge of the crowd, another figure had been watching silently. Unlike the recruits, he had not cheered, had not laughed, had not joined the rising tide of voices. His uniform was different, an insignia marking him as higher command, the kind of authority that did not need to shout to be felt. His eyes were sharp, calculating, his arms folded as he studied her movements with the intensity of someone reading a classified report. When she released the officer's arm in that final hold instead of breaking it, when she pulled the trigger with unshakable control after an endurance course meant to break her, he saw not just talent but discipline, something rare, something honed. And as the recruits continued to swarm around her with admiration, he stepped forward, his presence silencing the crowd as naturally as gravity silences a drifting object. "Enough," he said, his tone calm but commanding. The noise died immediately. The recruit straightened, the officer froze mid-breath, and she turned to face him with the same composed expression she had carried since the beginning. His eyes lingered on her longer than on anyone else, studying, measuring, perhaps even weighing something against memories of other soldiers he had known. "You've demonstrated more than skill," he said finally, his voice carrying across the circle. "You've demonstrated control. The kind of control that can't be taught easily. Tell me," his eyes narrowed slightly, "where did you learn it?" Her silence stretched for a moment, the kind of pause that draws every ear closer. When she spoke, her voice was low but steady. "It doesn't matter where," she said simply. "What matters is that it's mine." The answer stirred the recruits, though they stayed quiet under the officer's gaze. It wasn't defiance, not exactly, it was truth spoken without apology. She wasn't hiding, but she wasn't offering herself up for inspection either. She was, in every way, untouchable. The higher officer's lips pressed into the faintest hint of a smile, though his eyes betrayed no amusement. He saw in her what the others couldn't yet articulate. This was not the display of someone learning, but someone who had already been tempered in fire they couldn't see. The SEAL officer, still red-faced and breathing hard from his defeat, stepped forward as though to protest. "Sir, with respect, this is not regulation. She doesn't belong here. She's not one of us. This spectacle undermines the discipline of this unit." His voice cracked at the edges, more desperation than command. He needed to salvage something, anything, before his reputation collapsed entirely under the weight of her quiet victories. But the higher officer didn't turn to him. His gaze remained on her. "Discipline," he said, his voice smooth, measured, is exactly what I just saw. And it is discipline that holds units together when skill and strength fail. His words left no room for argument, and though the SEAL officer opened his mouth again, no sound followed. He knew better than to challenge his superior directly. The recruits, however, could hardly contain their energy now. They whispered among themselves not about the officer's protest but about her. "Where did she come from?" one murmured. "No one shoots like that. No one fights like that unless—" His words trailed off, unfinished but heavy with implication. Rumors began to grow even in those first moments. Some imagined she had trained with elite units in secret, others that she had a background buried deep in classified files, perhaps even darker, black ops, missions never recorded, battles never acknowledged. She didn't confirm or deny any of it. She simply stood quietly, letting their imaginations do the work. That mystery, that refusal to explain herself, only deepened their respect. She was more than a soldier now in their eyes. She was something untouchable, something beyond. The higher officer studied her for another long moment, then spoke again. "This unit exists to break limitations," he said. "And today you've shown us what that looks like. Remember this moment, all of you. Skill can be taught, strength can be built, but control—" He paused, his gaze still fixed on her. "Control is rare. And it is control that will win battles none of you will ever see written in history." His words landed heavily, leaving the recruits silent again, their admiration now tempered with a realization that they had just witnessed something significant, something that would echo far beyond this training day. As the crowd dispersed slowly under orders, the officer remained in the dirt, his pride still smoldering. She, however, returned to her seat as if nothing had happened, her calmness unbroken, her hands folded neatly once more. But inside the minds of everyone present, her image was burned in place. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She wasn't just a woman given a cleaning task. She was a force none of them had seen coming, and none of them would forget. Why the next morning, the story had spread beyond the training field. Recruits carried it like contraband gossip, passing details in hushed voices across the mess hall, in bunks, and even during drills when they thought no instructor was near enough to hear. Each retelling added another layer, some exaggerated, some stripped down to cold facts. They spoke of how she had assembled the rifle blindfolded, how she had hit the target no one could hit, how she had dismantled the SEAL officer in front of everyone without breaking a sweat. It was no longer just an isolated moment, it had become legend, and legends never travel quietly. By evening, officers in different wings of the base were repeating the story too, their voices tinged with curiosity, doubt, or a careful kind of interest reserved for matters that might reach higher command. She had arrived as an outsider. Now she was the center of gravity around which the entire unit seemed to orbit. The SEAL officer's humiliation deepened with every whisper. Wherever he went, eyes lingered on him not with respect but with something close to pity. Pride was currency in his world, and his had been stripped from him in the most public way possible. That night, he stood alone in the gym, fists pounding against the heavy bag, his breath ragged, sweat dripping into the mats. He replayed every moment, every strike she had dodged, every time her calm had mocked his fury. He told himself she had cheated, that it was luck, that somehow the course had been easier for her, that the fight had been rigged. But even in the privacy of his thoughts, the excuses rang hollow. He knew the truth. She had been better. That knowledge burned worse than any bruise on his skin. And though he couldn't admit it aloud, a seed of obsession took root. He couldn't rest until he understood who she was, and how she had made him look small. Meanwhile, the recruits continued speculating. Some swore they had seen her in old footage from conflicts overseas, though none could name the country. Others whispered that she had once been part of a covert unit, her name erased from official records. A few even said she had been involved in missions that never made the news, the kind where outcomes were spoken about only in classified rooms. When asked directly, she gave no answers. Her silence was fuel for their theories, her refusal to explain herself transforming her from soldier to myth. She didn't seek their curiosity, but she didn't stop it either. She simply existed in her own unshakable rhythm, as though the storm of attention belonged to someone else entirely. One evening, as the recruits sat in the barracks replaying the events yet again, one of the older sergeants entered, his face shadowed by a memory he didn't share easily. He sat on the edge of a bunk, silent at first, until the youngest among them asked, "Sergeant, have you ever seen anyone like her before?" The room hushed, waiting for his answer. He rubbed his chin, his eyes distant. "Not many," he said finally. "But once, years ago, I was deployed on a mission that went bad. Ambush. We were pinned down. Most of us thought we wouldn't make it out. Then someone showed up, someone who moved like a ghost, calm under fire. Precise, unshakable. She pulled us out one by one. Saved lives we'd already counted as lost. His voice dropped lower, almost reverent. I never saw her face clear in the chaos. But the way she moved, it was the same. The recruits leaned forward, eyes wide. You mean it was her? One whispered. The sergeant didn't answer directly. He just gave a small, knowing look and left the room, leaving them with the weight of his words. The rumors thickened after that. Even those who had doubted began to look at her differently, their respect deepening into something like awe. The higher officers took notice too, their conversations increasingly circling around her presence. Files were pulled, requests made, old records combed for connections that might explain her skill. But if anything was found, it didn't reach the recruits. To them, she remained an enigma, one who had shattered the arrogance of their strongest, mastered every test thrown her way, and carried herself with a calmness that seemed unbreakable. The SEAL officer couldn't let it go. His pride demanded answers, and his frustration drove him deeper into the shadows of her past. He cornered others, pressed them for information, but found only silence. At last, in desperation, he approached the higher officer who had spoken to her after the fight. Sir, he said stiffly, we need to know who she is. Where she came from. If she's to be part of us, we deserve to know. The higher officer looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said only this, some things are not yours to know. Focus on your own shortcomings before you worry about hers. The words cut deep, leaving the SEAL officer seething but powerless. And still she remained unchanged. Every day she carried herself with the same steady composure, the same quiet that seemed louder than any declaration. She wasn't chasing recognition. She wasn't fighting for approval. But everything she did, every movement, every choice commanded both. To the recruits she was becoming more than a soldier. She was a symbol. A reminder that greatness didn't always arrive with noise or rank or reputation. Sometimes it sat quietly, waiting to be underestimated, until the moment came to show the world what control really looked like. Days passed, and the mystery around her only thickened. The recruits still buzzed with curiosity, but their chatter no longer carried the careless edge of gossip. It had turned into reverence, the kind that belongs to something larger than life. Every time she walked past, conversations paused. Every time she picked up a weapon, silence followed, as if even the air was holding its breath. Yet she remained unchanged, her expression calm, her presence steady. She did not bask in their attention, nor did she deny it. She simply existed as though none of it mattered. But it mattered to them. It mattered to everyone, especially the officer who could not stop replaying his humiliation night after night, until the obsession grew heavy enough to crush him. He finally broke during a strategy session. Standing before the recruits and instructors, his voice sharp with barely contained anger, he snapped, "Enough of this charade. We cannot allow someone to remain here without identity, without clearance, without proof of who she is. This is a breach of security. For all we know, she could be a spy." His words were cut short by the sound of a door opening at the far end of the room. The higher officer stepped in, flanked by two others whose insignia outranked even his. Their arrival froze the room. Soldiers rose to attention, the weight of authority pressing down like a physical force. The woman, however, remained seated, her eyes steady, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. The highest ranking among them spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command that silenced all doubt. "You speak of identity," he said, his eyes fixed on the SEAL officer. "But identity is not something you deserve to demand. It is something granted on need. And you, Lieutenant, do not have the clearance to question hers." The room shifted uncomfortably, the recruits looking at one another, their curiosity clawing at the edges of discipline. The SEAL officer, red-faced and furious, sputtered, "With respect, sir, then who is she?" The answer came with the kind of finality that ended debates before they began. "She," the officer said, turning toward the woman with something like respect in his eyes, "is a decorated operative of a program so classified most of you will never hear its name again. She has operated in theaters you will never know, against enemies whose existence has never been acknowledged. Every time she stepped into the field, she carried not just skill, but responsibility you cannot yet comprehend. She has saved lives measured not in dozens but in thousands. And she has done it all without recognition." The silence that followed was absolute. The recruits stared, their imaginations suddenly dwarfed by the reality. Even the SEAL officer, for all his arrogance, faltered, his mouth opening only to close again as the truth bore down on him. She had not needed to say a word. Her past had spoken for her, carried in the voices of those who had clearance enough to know. And now that truth settled heavily over everyone in the room. The higher officer continued, his tone measured but edged with something personal. When we gave her a weapon to clean, she did not object. When we doubted her aim, she did not boast. When challenged to fight, she did not destroy, she controlled. That is why she is here. Not to prove herself to you, but to remind us what discipline, precision, and restraint look like when forged in fire. His gaze shifted across the room, stopping on the SEAL officer whose pride was now stripped bare. You, he said pointedly, could learn from her. The words hit harder than any blow. The officer looked away, shame battling stubbornness, but he could not deny the truth standing in front of him. The recruits, however, were transformed. Their respect shifted into something deeper, something approaching reverence. They know. Longer whispered rumors. They carried themselves differently, straighter, sharper, as if hoping even a fragment of her discipline might rub off on them. They knew they would never see someone like her again, not in training, not in service, not in their entire careers. She wasn't just another soldier. They understood now she was the measure by which all others would silently be compared. She rose from her seat at last, her expression still calm, her eyes steady as she looked across the room. You don't need to know the details, she said, her voice carrying clearly, steady as steel. What matters is that discipline is not about strength, not about pride, not about proving yourself. Discipline is about control. It's about carrying responsibility even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know what you've done. Remember that, and you won't need to know who I am. With that, she stepped past them, her movements quiet but commanding, leaving silence in her wake. No one tried to stop her. No one dared. The recruits exchanged glances heavy with the realization that they had witnessed something they would carry for the rest of their lives. The SEAL officer, left behind with his pride in ruins, lowered his gaze, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. And as the door closed behind her, it felt less like a departure and more like the ending of a lesson, one so profound it would ripple through every life in that room. What began as a simple cleaning task had ended as revelation. She had needed no title, no rank, no explanation. She had shown them that control was the sharpest weapon of all, one capable of cutting through arrogance, through doubt, through the walls people built around themselves. And though she was gone, the echo of her presence remained, etched into the minds of everyone who had seen her. Proof that sometimes, the most extraordinary legends begin in the quietest moments, and the strongest victories are won without ever raising a voice. The end.